To truly understand the story of the Scharnhorst-class battleships, we must first look at the state of German shipbuilding in the wake of the First World War and the tense geopolitical landscape of that era. Following the signing of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, Germany faced severe military restrictions. The nation was forbidden from maintaining a genuine air force, and the Navy was bound by strict limits. Most notably, the construction of combat vessels displacing more than 10,000 long tons was prohibited. It was not until the mid-1920s that the Navy began replacing its obsolete armored ships, which had by then surpassed the 20-year service life permitted by the treaty. The first design to emerge for these new heavy artillery ships was the Deutschland class, a family of vessels that included the famous Admiral Graf Spee. During their development, engineers were forced to find a difficult compromise between the limited displacement of 10,000 tons and the need for serious firepower. The result was a ship armed with 6 guns of 283 millimeters. This armament was heavier than the 203 millimeter guns found on heavy cruisers, yet lighter than the main battery of a full-fledged battleship. These vessels, which the world soon came to know as pocket battleships, were never intended to stand in the line of battle against modern capital ships. Instead, thanks to their powerful engines and exceptional cruising range, their primary tactical role was commerce raiding. However, in the 1930s, intelligence arrived concerning the expansion of the French fleet, which Germany viewed as a primary potential adversary. France had begun constructing the new, fast battleships of the Dunkirk class. The design of these French ships had been a long process, navigating international naval treaties, but their arrival forced Germany's hand. They needed a ship capable of effectively countering the Dunkirk. This strategic necessity was the direct catalyst for the development of the Scharnhorst class. During the design phase, engineers explored several concepts ranging from 18,000 to 26,000 tons, debating between artillery calibers of 283 millimeters or larger 330 millimeter guns. In the final design, they chose to stick with the 283 millimeter caliber, similar to the earlier Deutschland class, though the turrets and the guns themselves were significantly modernized. By choosing the smaller caliber, they saved weight, which was then poured into armor protection. In fact, the armor scheme on these ships was so robust that in some aspects it surpassed even the massive Tirpitz class that would follow. Construction began initially in the mid-1930s, but work was halted to redesign the ships for a larger displacement. They were laid down again in 1935. The Scharnhorst was launched on October 3, 1936, followed by her sister ship, the Gneisenau, in December of that same year. After 2 to 3 years of fitting out, they entered service in 1939 and 1938 respectively. Although there were minor structural differences between the two sister ships, their core characteristics were nearly identical. The main battery consisted of 3 triple turrets housing 283 millimeter guns with a barrel length of roughly 54 calibers. These guns fired shells weighing between 315 and 336 kilograms with a muzzle velocity of approximately 900 meters per second. The crews could achieve a rate of fire of 2 to 3 rounds per minute. At their maximum elevation of 40 degrees, these guns could engage targets at a range of about 41 kilometers. Each gun was supplied with 150 rounds. These weapons were designed primarily to destroy heavy cruisers and moderately armored battleships like the French Dunkirk. However, against large capital ships with heavy armor, such as the British battleships dating back to the First World War, their effectiveness was considered limited. Backing up the main battery was a secondary armament of 150 millimeter guns. The anti-aircraft defense suite included weapons of 105 millimeters, 37 millimeters, and 20 millimeters, though this configuration was frequently upgraded and altered throughout the ship's service lives. The armor protection on these ships was truly exceptional. The main belt thickness stood at 350 millimeters, tapering down to 170 millimeters at the lower edge. The face of the main gun turrets reached 360 millimeters, while the roof was 100 millimeters thick, and the barbettes ranged from 200 to 350 millimeters. With a standard displacement of around 32,000 tons, the total weight of the armor was a staggering 14,500 tons. That is 44% of the ship's entire displacement. For the propulsion system, the designers made a distinct choice. Unlike the diesel engines found on the Deutschland class, they selected steam turbines. This decision did result in a reduction of operating range, which was about 8,000 nautical miles at economic cruising speeds. However, even with that limitation, these characteristics made the ships perfectly capable of operating as commerce raiders in the Atlantic Ocean. The story of the Scharnhorst begins with her name. The battleship was christened in honor of the Prussian general Gerhard von Scharnhorst. Alongside General Gneisenau, he led the military reforms that introduced universal conscription to Prussia. It was fitting then that two sister ships of the German fleet would bear the names of these two commanders. Scharnhorst entered service on January 7, 1939. But almost immediately, technical flaws began to appear, specifically poor seaworthiness and a tendency to take heavy water over the bow. Despite attempts to modernize and fix her, they never completely solved the ship's struggles in stormy conditions. At the outbreak of the Second World War, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, often operating as a pair, took part in Operation Weserübung, the invasion of Denmark and Norway. The occupation of Denmark was swift and accomplished without significant losses, but the campaign in Norway turned into a drawn-out struggle. Allied forces landed about 55,000 troops, 6 divisions, backed by artillery and air power, in an attempt to hold the line. During this campaign, Scharnhorst was tasked with covering the landings and supporting German ground operations. Eventually, as the situation on the Western Front deteriorated, Allied troops were evacuated, leaving Norway under German control. Until the very final stages of the operation, the battleship had not been involved in any major surface engagements. That changed on June 8, 1940, the day the Norwegian campaign officially ended. In the Norwegian Sea, a battle took place that resulted in the destruction of the British aircraft carrier HMS Glorious. This clash in the Norwegian Sea marked a first in naval history. It was the first time battleships engaged an aircraft carrier with artillery fire. The German battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau intercepted HMS Glorious, a converted battlecruiser and sister ship to the Furious, which was sailing with an escort of just 2 destroyers. There are 2 main theories explaining why her escort was so small. The first suggests the ship was running critically low on fuel. The second points to a severe personal conflict between the ship's captain and the commander of the air group, a dispute that required a court-martial. Because of this, the ship did not wait for the large evacuation convoy leaving Norway, and instead headed for Scapa Flow alone. Since Glorious had been providing cover for the evacuation of Allied troops, her air group consisted primarily of fighters. She carried only 5 Swordfish torpedo bombers, which were known for their slow speed. Her escort was limited to 2 destroyers because the other available ships were tied up protecting the main convoy. The carrier was sailing in a zigzag pattern to counter the threat of submarines, but she was moving at a slow speed, a detail that indirectly confirms the theory that she was indeed suffering from a fuel shortage. The ship had been spotted and identified by the enemy. At 17:27, the Gneisenau opened fire with her secondary battery, targeting the escort destroyer. Just 1 minute later, at 17:28, the alarm was sounded aboard the aircraft carrier. At 17:32, the Scharnhorst opened fire on the Glorious from a range of 25 kilometers. With her very first salvo, she scored a direct hit. The shell tore through the flight deck, making it impossible for the torpedo bombers, which were already prepped for attack, to take off. An explosion in the hangar ignited a fierce fire, and the crew began a desperate struggle for damage control. By 1746, the Gneisenau joined in the bombardment of the carrier, which was now effectively defenseless without her aircraft. At the same time, a barrage from the 150mm guns was directed at the destroyers. They were trying to screen the carrier with smoke and launch a counterattack with torpedoes. At 1742, a salvo of 4 torpedoes was launched at the Scharnhorst, but none found their mark. The destroyers did manage to land 1 hit with a 120mm shell, but it caused no significant damage to the battleship. After a brief exchange, the carrier, despite the fires raging on board, managed to increase her speed to 26 knots. However, the battleships closed the distance once again. At 1756, another salvo straddled the Glorious. A shell struck the bridge, killing the captain and everyone else present at the command post. The Glorious temporarily disappeared into the smoke, gaining a brief moment of respite. The destroyer Ardent, while laying that protective smokescreen, came under intense fire from the auxiliary batteries and sank at 1822. Soon after, another shell from the Gneisenau smashed into the carrier's engine room, and the ship went dead in the water. the destroyer Acasta made a brave attempt to provide cover with smoke and launched a torpedo spread. The battleship Gneisenau managed to evade the attack, but one of the torpedoes struck the Scharnhorst. Despite a large hole in her hull, the ship's robust construction allowed her to maintain speed and combat effectiveness. Even after taking on nearly 2,000 tons of water, the Scharnhorst continued to pour artillery fire into the Glorious. By that point, the British vessel was immobilized, engulfed in flames, and at 19:08 she sank. Just a few minutes later, the destroyer Acasta was also destroyed by secondary fire. After the battle, both German battleships headed for Trondheim, Norway. Only about 40 survivors were pulled from the water. The British side suffered a total loss of 1,520 men. While in the Norwegian port, the ships came under air attack from the carrier Ark Royal, though the raid failed to achieve any success. Due to the serious damage she had sustained, the Scharnhorst was transferred to Kiel, where she remained under repair until the end of 1940. Once battle-ready, the ships were sent into the Atlantic for raiding operations under the command of Admiral Gunther Lütjens. Their operations against merchant shipping were effective, although attacks on convoys were often broken off due to the appearance of heavy escorts, which included British battleships like the Ramillies and the Malaya. Engaging them directly was considered too risky. During this cruise, the Scharnhorst sank 8 vessels totaling 50,000 tons. The group's combined score was 22 ships, with a total tonnage of 115,500 tons. Upon completing the Atlantic raid, the squadron arrived in Brest, a major base for the German Navy. There, they were joined by the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen. While docked in the French port, the ships were subjected to regular bombing raids by Allied aircraft, making it necessary to relocate them back to Germany for repairs and modernization. 2 routes were considered: a long journey through the North Atlantic or a dash through the English Channel. The second option carried immense risk. The narrowest part of the channel is only 32 kilometers wide. The waters were heavily mined and lay well within the striking range of the British Air Force and Navy. To ensure a successful breakthrough across the English Channel, the German command organized a massive and audacious operation. The covering force alone consisted of dozens of minesweepers and approximately 300 aircraft. The plan called for the operation to be conducted during daylight hours, a decision that demanded an extraordinary level of preparation and absolute secrecy. To achieve this, a campaign of disinformation was launched. The ships were conspicuously loaded with equipment and supplies designed for a tropical climate, simulating preparations for a long voyage into the South Atlantic. These deceptive measures were so effective that they successfully concealed the true intentions of the command from enemy aerial reconnaissance right up until the operation began. The events unfolded between the 11th and the 13th of February 1942. The German capital ship slipped out of the port of Brest under the cover of darkness on the night of February 12th. The air cover operation was executed by a group of fighters, including the Messerschmitt Bf-110, which were fitted with specialized equipment designed to jam British radar stations. This was supplemented by powerful jamming stations on the French coast. As a result of these electronic warfare measures, the British side was unable to detect the movement of the squadron for a long time, dismissing the interference on their screens as mere atmospheric anomalies. The ships managed to cover a significant distance completely unnoticed. Discovery came down to pure chance. Crews of Spitfire fighters returning from a routine mission spotted the squadron. However, the report confirming the presence of large German capital ships in the English Channel, escorted by a vast number of minesweepers, did not reach command until 30 minutes after the planes had landed, around 1 o'clock in the afternoon on February 12th. Once discovered, the ships came under fire from coastal artillery batteries with a caliber of 9.2 inches, though no hits were recorded. However, the squadron soon encountered minefields. A mine explosion occurred just 100 feet from the battlecruiser Scharnhorst, causing severe damage to her turbines. The ship lost all power and propulsion, sitting dead in the water for 20 minutes before the crew managed to restore movement. British destroyers attempted to intercept the fleet, but closing to torpedo range against a large formation of heavy ships proved incredibly difficult. The lead destroyer, which managed to close the distance to about 3,000 yards, was caught in the concentrated broadside of 3 German capital ships. The vessel suffered critical damage and caught fire, with a significant loss of life among the crew. Yet, against the odds, the destroyer remained afloat, was towed back to Great Britain and was eventually restored to service. Throughout the day, attacks on the ships were pressed by British bombers, specifically the Hampton and Blenheim types. The German squadron's air defense was maintained by fighters, including the Messerschmitt Bf-110 and the Focke-Wulf 190, operating in designated zones along the route. By the evening of February 12th, the battleship Gneisenau struck a mine. Later, around 9:30 at night, the Scharnhorst suffered a second mine strike. The explosion under the hull caused the turbines to fail once again. Despite these heavy damages, the ships reached the German coast in the early hours of February 13th. The Gneisenau entered the Heligoland Bight at 3:50 in the morning, while the Scharnhorst limped into Wilhelmshaven later that day. This operation is evaluated as one of the riskiest and most massive actions undertaken by the German naval forces during the entire war. Despite the damage sustained by the ships, the breakout was a success. In the British press, the event was widely publicized and subjected to harsh criticism, labeled as a humiliating failure for the Royal Navy. However, the dash through a strait that was under constant observation and gunfire required immense effort. The ships subsequently required a long period of repair. The restoration of the Scharnhorst continued until March of 1942. Once the work was completed, the ship was redeployed to Norway to operate in conjunction with the battleship Tirpitz. The primary objective of this powerful task force was the interception of the northern convoys delivering aid to the Soviet Union. Their joint training exercises concluded with an operation to bombard the island of Spitsbergen. It is noted that this was the only instance where the Tirpitz fired her main caliber guns at surface targets. For the better part of 1942, no active combat operations were conducted. The final battle of the Scharnhorst took place at the end of 1943. In terms of the tactical situation and the desperate nature of the fight, it bears a striking resemblance to the final stand of the battleship Bismarck. On December 24th, vital intelligence reports came in. A massive Allied convoy was on the move. To intercept it, the German battleship Scharnhorst, accompanied by 5 escorting destroyers, put to sea on Christmas Day, 1943. The operation was conducted under strict radio silence. However, as the night of December 26th wore on, they failed to locate the convoy. In a move that would prove fatal, the destroyers were detached to scout a separate sector, leaving the mighty battleship completely without cover. The British side, however, was listening. They had intercepted the German radio traffic and realized the Scharnhorst was operating alone. This crucial information was relayed to the HMS Duke of York. As a King George V-class battleship, she was a formidable opponent, armed with 10 14-inch guns and protected by a heavy armored belt nearly 15 inches thick. In a head-to-head clash, she held a significant advantage over the German capital ship. At 8:36 in the morning, the Scharnhorst was picked up on the radar screens of the cruisers Norfolk and Belfast. The British ships opened fire immediately. While the German return fire was largely ineffective, British shells found their mark. The most critical hit destroyed the Scharnhorst's forward radar, effectively blinding her. This severely limited her ability to track targets. Despite taking hits from 11-inch shells, the Scharnhorst used her superior speed to break contact, circling around to try and attack the convoy from a different direction. The British cruisers gave chase. During the second engagement, the Scharnhorst finally scored hits. She struck the cruiser Norfolk, flooding the magazine of one of her turrets and disabling her radar equipment. The next salvo straddled the cruiser Sheffield, damaging her deck and hull. The German battleship broke away once more, but this time she could not completely shake off her pursuers. The decision was made to return to base, and orders were sent to the destroyers, but the trap had already shut. The Duke of York had positioned herself perfectly between the Scharnhorst and the safety of the Norwegian coast. Trying to avoid detection, the German ship had switched off her aft radar to hide its signal. At 4:17 p.m., the Duke of York's radar locked onto the target at a range of about 25 miles. Star shells turned night into day, and at 4:50 p.m., the British battleship unleashed a full broadside with her main guns, joined by the cruiser Jamaica. The sudden appearance of a capital ship took the German crew completely by surprise. The damage was catastrophic. The Scharnhorst lost speed, and 2 of her main gun turrets were knocked out. Although one turret kept firing, the outcome was inevitable. Her power plant was crippled. Now a sitting duck, the great ship was hammered at point-blank range. British destroyers and cruisers launched a total of 55 torpedoes, 11 of which slammed into the hull. The Duke of York continued to pour fire into the burning wreck from close range. Once the ship slipped beneath the waves, British vessels moved in. They found only debris and oil on the surface. Out of a massive crew, only 36 sailors were pulled from the freezing water. No officers were among the survivors. On December 27th, the squadron pulled into Kola Bay to refuel before returning to their base at Scapa Flow. The sailors from the Duke of York and the cruisers received not only British honors but also Soviet state awards, including the Order of Suvorov. This marked the end of the Battle of North Cape, fought on December 26, 1943, recorded in history as the northernmost naval battle of the war. Historians still debate the exact factors that sealed the Scharnhorst's fate: the withdrawal of her destroyer escort, her persistent attempts to re-engage the convoy, or the fatal interception and decryption of her radio communications. It is also worth mentioning her sister ship, the Gneisenau. While her service history is fascinating, she suffered critical damage from air raids during the middle of the war. There were projects to repair and rearm her with massive 15-inch guns, but following the famous Channel Dash, Operation Cerberus, her days as an active combatant were effectively over.